This is Heal Your Mind, Heal Your Body with Dr. Schuyler. Discover how your thoughts manifest disease and what you can do about it. Here's your host, Dr. Schuyler.
Welcome back, beautiful souls. So, do you think your empathy might be making you sick? Do you think that your stress is yours, or are you actually just catching vibes of someone else? Is the way you feel, is your anxiety of you, or is it from you? Or maybe you're just catching it from someone else. We hear the term empath over and over again. It's used so much. And when people care about that you're hurting, do you feel their pain so deeply? Even if they're out of crisis mode, are you still feeling what the other person was experiencing? In relationships, do you donate a lot of your own natural resources and you disinvest in yourself, but you invest into other people? It's like you overdraw on your own bank account, emotional bank account, over and over again. And sometimes with those you're close to, do you find them a little frustrated with you because you're experiencing this decision fatigue or this decision paralysis? You don't even know what you want for dinner. So yeah, those are signs of being an empath or someone who's highly empathetic. So the term empathy or empath is from the Greek word in, and pathos, feeling, in feelings. So the term empathy means you're able to feel into others' feelings. But for, this term we coin empaths, this sensitivity is significantly magnified to this really big degree, even to the point where it could be causing stress and disease. So empaths, they're more tuned in, they're more sympathetic than the average person. And a strong component of empathy can be emotional intelligence. We call it EQ. And this refers to the ability to recognize and understand, but really, more importantly, to hold the space for others' needs and emotions over your own. You can hold the space for a coworker, you can hold the space for a loved one, for your child, but you don't necessarily hold the space for yourself because you have high emotional intelligence. The opposite example of this is someone who lacks empathy. This can be found in someone with narcissistic personality disorders or someone with antisocial personality disorder, or oftentimes to a varying degree, someone who has an avoidant attachment. They simply lack empathy. They have an empathy deficit. But the opposite side is someone who has this immense sense of sensitivity. So the last episode, we went over the dorsal vagal complex. So how does empathy tie in to the dorsal vagal complex and the immobilization, this frozen response? This 2024 study came out in the UK with people with autism. They experience empathy in different ways, and many of them reported feelings of empathy that were overwhelming, and they described it, quote, "I absorb other people's emotions, and I almost know how people are feeling before they're aware of it themselves. And I feel empathy so much that it's painful." Now, I don't have a form of autism or what I know of neurodivergence, but I can completely relate to this statement, and I'm going to venture to guess that many people out there can completely relate to that statement, and they're not on the spectrum. They may not have a form of neurodivergence. And we do know from studies that ASD is linked to dorsal vagal shutdown. So it's really not a far cry for people who have hyper empathetic behaviors to experience more frozen response. And you look at the keen sense of neuroception we've talked about over the past episodes. Neuroception is what happens within milliseconds. Neuroception happens before the sympathetic. It's when your brain is constantly scanning for threat detections around you. It's linked to mirror neurons. We talked about neurons. Mirror neurons are your ability to understand what other people are going through. Highly empathic people have a lot of neurons, mirror neurons. This keeps you this sense of safety, especially if you had a traumatic childhood or an emotionally neglectful childhood. You develop this keen sense of being able to understand the people around you, how they're feeling before they even speak it or say it, because this kept you safe. If someone came in the room and they had a bad vibe, something in you told you something was off, This kept you safe. So you start to develop this ability to read people, this highly empathic ability to read people in order to keep you emotionally safe. So the sense of emotional trauma, the sense of emotional drive to keep yourself, it's a heightened state of awareness. And people who experience adverse childhood experience, chronic invalidation, develop this immense skill for empathy. And they begin to get sick. Now think back to the glue that binds the mind to the body, emotions, neuroimmunology. Highly empathic people often experience this dorsal vagal frozen shutdown because they can experience through neuroception and mirror neurons other people's thoughts and emotions. So being tuned into this, like being sensitive, it is an asset. It's a gift. Like I'm very grateful for the gift of having this ability, but it also comes at a cost until you learned how to create boundaries for it. So as a recovering empath myself, I'm still very empathetic at work, but not to a point where it's hyper empathic, where it's going to continue to create disease within me. Empaths are usually vulnerable to the emotional contagion, stress contagion. We definitely went over this, and that's definitely worth an episode checking out. Catching other people's vibes, and the exact same way you would catch a cold or the flu. But it doesn't stop there. People who are highly empathetic physically get ill and suffer from anxiety, depression, chronic stress, chronic pain, professional burnout, and they have pain syndromes more often than their less empathetic counterparts. So empaths often need a lot of downtime after social engagements and a long recovery periods of time after a workday or extended intervals of being alone. They can feel just completely different from other people. Oftentimes, I get people tell me, I just feel like an alien. I feel like I don't fit in this world. Everyone's so cruel. Oftentimes, empaths are partnered with a toxic, abusive partner, and they somehow feel that they are the ones that are damaged. They are the one that something's wrong with them. That because they feel so much and they're told they're too sensitive, they're often with very avoidant, toxic, non-empathetic people, they begin to believe the Darvo effect, that they're the problem. So a good checklist to feel if you have this high sense of empathy is, do you struggle with boundaries? Is it tough to know where you leave off and where others begin? Like you struggle kind of figuring out, is this my experience or am I literally catching their vibes? Am I having secondary embarrassment? Both my daughters have pretty high empathy actually, and one of them can't watch anything sad and the other one can't watch anything embarrassing. She's like, oh my God, I can't take it. I can't take it. I'm so embarrassed. I'm so embarrassed. And she like curls up in a fetal position and puts a blanket over her head. I'm so embarrassed. I can't stand up watching this. So she's experiencing this secondhand embarrassment. There's also something called vicarious trauma, where brain studies show when a loved one experiences trauma, we experience it the same way as if it's happening to us. It's vicarious trauma, vicarious embarrassment, vicarious emotions. Another example is, do you often feel like you're not in your body? Like you're experiencing this sense of dissociation. Like if you leave your body, you're not directly connected to it. Last episode, dorsal vagal complex. That's something else that's very common. You're really, really vulnerable to catching other people's vibes, especially at work, and especially anyone who's an authoritative figure. Colleagues you want to impress, bosses you want to impress, teachers you want to impress, parents you want to impress, loved ones you want to impress. That you're constantly feeling this emotional contagion of other people trying to please them. Do you feel like your nervous system is in overdrive sometimes just by having a conversation? Like an area that's large and overpopulated, does your nervous system go into fight or flight? Are you like, oh my God, just get me out of here? Like you're looking for the exits. You just feel this immense sense of overwhelming, oh my God, this is just too much. This is just too much to take in right now. So what you're struggling with is emotional balance versus your authentic self needs. And what's so ironic about, people who are highly empathic is they have this extraordinary capacity for union. And this is where you often see therapists and teachers and nurses. And in a crisis, when people need them, they're able to pull upon their deepest abilities to hold the space for somebody. They're oftentimes very emotionally gifted. They're oftentimes healers, energy workers, light workers, nurses, therapists, just people who will be stopped in a grocery store and someone will tell you their deepest, darkest secrets. It's almost like you attract people to come to you. It's like this magnet for other people's problems. And you have this magnetic quality that draws people to you, that draws people's dark sides to you, and they expose them, and they ask for your advice and they ask for your input. And you just find yourself always showing up for other people, but you're the last person to show up for yourself. It's like these dark parts of yourself, the dark parts of being empathetic, cause this stress and disease response, these automatic negative thoughts, this gaslighting of your own needs because you're constantly meeting other people's needs. It's as if you haven't quite developed boundaries as an empath. You're giving too much space for other people's emotional lives. Like you're totally okay solving their problems. You love hearing about theirs. And you can help them with great ease. You can help them restore equilibrium, but it's all at the expense of your own. So you get in this habit of showing up for other people, but a difficulty returning to your own emotional center. This actually begins to create that discord within, that sense of unsafety, that sense of people pleasing, abandonment of self, emotional flooding, chronic frozen response. You can't be in fight or flight. So this has a difficulty balancing your immune system. It's, you're at a party and you're feeling everyone's vibes all around you and you're just taking it all in. And you step in this party and it feels overwhelming. You're just exhausted. That's what an impasse environment is like. What a neurodivergence environment is like. Your nervous system is constantly dialed into other people's emotional states, catching vibes of your partner, catching vibes of your boss, your best friend's sadness after a breakup. You feel it as much as they do. Vicarious trauma on TV. Watching the news is so detrimental to people with high empathy. This high empathetic need, this inherent part of who you are, this gift, which has become a curse, reinforces anxiety, reinforces depression, reinforces chronic stress. And when you're looking at social media, now you're looking at complete overload and exhaustion. So for empaths, intimacy comes down to matters of space and reciprocity. Sometimes you may crave intense emotional, physical, and most oftentimes I'm seeing spiritual bonding in so many of my patients. And other times you need so much personal space, it feels like your own galaxy is not enough space for you. And I really found this as so many people are going through this awakening, and I do not mean political, going through this sense of awakening, this attunement into authentic self, this attunement into essential self. There's such a crave for spiritual bonding, and people are beginning to feel more and more isolated as they're seeking the spiritual bonding. They're met with more toxicity. So they begin to withdraw and turn inward, and you feel like you can't sometimes get enough space in this world. But you have this crave where you really, really want to merge with people, but you're often threatened if like you can't breathe because their vibe is so intense. So you may appear remote. You may begin to pull back because you're getting so uncomfortable receiving other people's bad vibes, other people's bad juju. And this is coming out in droves, and there's podcasts completely dedicated to this. And I'm just lightly going to touch on this. But empath's very giving nature naturally attracts people with narcissistic tendencies. I'm not saying everyone's a narcissist. That's so overused. You're very comfortable helping other people on their emotional journeys. And narcissistic people with narcissistic traits are highly drawn to this. You crave mirror and validation, and this becomes someone with avoidant attachment style or someone on the low empathy scale. This is like they're like a magnet to you. They're completely drawn because you embrace everything they wish they had. So again, that's this whole separate podcast, but oftentimes people who are highly empathetic find themselves in very toxic, abusive relationships. So you begin to settle for what we call emotional breadcrumbs. Oftentimes in past live in this world where they live off a world of breadcrumbs. They're just breadcrumbs when malnourished of emotional connection because they draw people who suck this energy life force from them. And then they're just craving some sort of intimate feedback, some sort of, reciprocity where you're giving this emotional nourishment back. And they're just breadcrumbed and they become emotionally malnourished. They become starving and then they turn into themselves because they can't express their needs. They can't express what they need because it's then turned back on them. It's used against them. Malnourishment, emotional malnourishment. They begin to disconnect from themselves, get out of fight or flight, move into this dorsal vagal shutdown complex. They develop this emotional immunity because they pick up on other people's emotions so much. Their direct inner experience becomes really hard to identify. And because they become so anxious, so depressed, chronic pain, immune system issues, and your nervous system becomes flooded, your physical body becomes exhausted, your emotional body is exhausted, your immune system becomes absolutely exhausted, adrenal fatigue, this sense of like you're constantly in this fog, like you don't want to get up, you're just like you're sludging through mud all the time. And you're more exposed to emotional issues like anxiety and depression, chronic stress, autoimmune illnesses, allergies, lupus, fibromyalgia, chronic widespread pain. So you go back a little bit into, the biology of this, where science and psychology merge. This emotional state of empathy is supposed to occur. It needs to be there to survive in our emotional environment. And social animals in particular, like primates, they're really capable of displaying these social emotional cues, understanding the status of other people. And we talked about mirror neurons. We must have empathy in order to exist in this relationship. And if you ever seen dogs have this too, have you seen those videos? You may have it. If you're on crutches and hopping, your dog might start to hop. Your dog might start to kind of walk funny with the limp. People whose dogs experience some sort of pain, they experience the same pain. Watching your fur baby suffer, you begin to suffer too. This vicarious sense of empathy, and especially with animals, you can feel it. It's as if the boundaries get blurred between their pain and your pain. And when does it become unhealthy? When does it create disease? And one of the biggest questions I ask my patients is this stress of you? Like, is this yours? Or were you just catching other people's vibes, embracing it, depleting your emotional bank account, and now you're becoming sick? And to back this up a little bit with science is this 2020 paper came out saying neuroscientists confirm that compassion does not cause fatigue. And it should not be called chronic fatigue anymore, but it should be called empathetic distressed fatigue. So that's kind of interesting. This distinction matters. The capacity to remain clear about self versus others is a distinction of emotional regulation. Without emotional regulation, self and others becomes blurred. Highly empathic people begin to blur the boundaries of what's self and what's others. So think like a nurse. Nurses are known for compassion fatigue. Empathetic distress fatigue is more like it. When you think of nurses, and I see probably about 40 patients a week, 6 of those 40 are nurses. That's a large percentage of my practice is nurses. And shout out to all the nurses out there. Just adore all of you. And 5 of the 6 nurses have an autoimmune, a GI disorder, or some sort of medical concern. Nurses are notorious for lack of self-care, lack of boundaries, and high empathetic levels for other people. And they're surrounded by disease and stress all day long. And they go home and they collapse. And they are exhausted because they're experiencing this hyper empathetic response. We talked about the dorsal vagal shutdown. You have this hyper empathetic response. It begins to become too much. Therapists, teachers, nurses were all known for burnout, for having this high empathetic burnout. So when you look at the forms of empathy, there's 3 forms of it. Cognitive, and that's your ability to place yourself in other people's shoes. You can understand their emotions. Not only do you understand them, but you can feel them. You really understand their perspective. And this is what's so dangerous about, the dynamics of a toxic person, a healthy person. Are you over empathizing with the person in your life to the point where you're ignoring their red flags because you're able to understand their dark side so well? You're abandoning yourself just to meet their needs. Dark side of empathy. Active empathy is known as affective empathy. Affective empathy is known as emotional empathy. This is when you emotionally share the feelings the other person is experiencing. You can be affected by that person's emotions so much it becomes your own. What the people were saying who have autism, they feel the people's pain so much it actually physically hurts. And then compassion empathy. You feel how people are suffering, nurses, therapists. You really feel that people are suffering and to the point where you can actually internalize that. So there's this thing called, hyperempathy ailment, and it's not in the DSM. It's not an actual diagnosis. It's more a way of clinician for qualifying how someone presents being over empathetic, how they empathize other people. But hyperempathy syndrome, quote unquote, not an actual diagnosis, but like this, again, this way of qualifying strong emotional reactions to other people's negative experiences. You feel emotional responses to other people's pain can last for even days. My daughter watched the Hunger Games when she was, maybe 11 or 12. She was sad for 2 weeks. Like, it was a legit issue. She cannot watch any more sad or stressful movies. It's a hardcore no in this family, even though she's 15. You feel overwhelming talking to other people about their problems because you feel like it's happening to you. You're so focused on other people's problems, you neglect yourself. You find it hard to say no to other people because you're always feeling sorry for them, very indicative of unhealthy relationships. And you're often labeled as you're being too sensitive. I was just joking. I'm just being sensitive. You're just being too sensitive. It's Darvode. It's deny, attack, reverse, victim, offender. Your emotions become your problem to the point you cannot express a need. You cannot fight back. You cannot flee. You go into dorsal vagal shutdown. Is your empathy creating disease, people? It's a legit question. The science and psychology is merging. This is something really to consider in the mind-body connection, again, that no one's talking about. When it's left unmanaged, this hyperempathy is harmful to your mental health. It's harmful to your physical health. I see this in IBS, joint pain. Every single person I work with that are on the spectrum of not having narcissism or antisocial is hyper-empathetic. So as you take a look at your life and you start to take inventory of who you're spending your time with, who you're hanging out with, how many vibes you're catching, stress contagion, are you experiencing hyper-empathetic? I don't want to use the word syndrome because it's not in the DSM, so I have to be mindful. Hyper-empathetic tendencies. But I will say in the UK, they are recognizing this as a syndrome. It's just not in the DSM, so I can't call it a syndrome. Got to take the science and facts on this one. But what I can say is that hyperempathy is something because we do know empathetic deficits exist. So hyperempathy exists as well. 10 out of 10 patients with IBS, GI disorders, autoimmune disorders, at some point in time before they became in a dorsal vagal shutdown complex syndrome, were overly empathetic people who absorbed other people's emotions and became sick themselves. Think about that. The odds are, if you're listening to this, you probably are drawn to this way of thinking, that you yourself are probably highly empathetic, that you catch other people's vibes and you feel emotionally exhausted at the end of the day. So the antidote to this is self-love. The antidote to this is to not abandon self. And that boundaries are not just saying no. Boundaries are choosing your emotional needs over someone else's. If you deplete your own emotional bank account, you overdraw and you overdraw and you overdraw, and you're under chronic stress, the immune system shuts down. It's not going to heal a cut on your hand if you're in chronic stress. This creates disease. So it starts with choosing you. And people always say, I can't do that. I feel selfish. That's because we were programmed by choosing ourselves. We feel selfish. No. Choosing yourself is the highest form of self-love you could ever do. I always hear mothers say, I feel so guilty choosing myself. Well, matriarch goes down, patriarch goes down, the whole family goes down. Parents feel guilty choosing their own self-care over their children. Get the matriarch or patriarch going down, the kids can't function. It shows that evidence-based suggests when the parents are happy, especially the mother, children are happy and less likely to experience anxiety and depression. Parents are happy, children less likely to experience IBS, anxiety. So if you're feeling a sense of guilt, well, I can't choose me, can you choose it for your children to start with? And start thinking, hey, wait, am I saving space for everyone else, but not enough space for me? If you take a look at my website, drskylar.net, you're actually going to see a workbook that you can follow along and start doing these practices. And the workbook is designed almost like having a one-on-one with me. As you listen to the podcast and you work the workbook, there's different tools and antidotes and ways of getting yourself out of being overly empathetic, how to get yourself out of frozen response. I do have 2 books coming out. Empower Your Child to Heal. It's all these things that we're talking about. Is your child over empathetic? Are they a people pleaser? Are they constantly seeking your validation? Are they high emotionally intelligent? And then what you can do as a parent to help your child begin to heal from autoimmune anxiety and GI disorders. The other book is for people without children. It's Empower Yourself to Heal, Merging Science and Psychologies. And it goes over the part 1 of science and the part 2 is psychology, merging the two. And it's 8 ways to master your mind, to stop the disease process. And it goes over the science, goes over the psychology. It breaks all of this down. And I do have a retreat coming up in the fall, as well as an online workshop. If you're interested, if you go to the website, drskylar.net, you'll see on there, you can sign up for emails. There are some free downloads in there, actually even a sneak peek into one of the books, What is Your Healing Phase? And you can get monthly newsletters and more sneak peeks into the book and updates, and you can put in there in the subject line, retreat or workshop, and my assistants will get more information to you. But it should be published on the website pretty soon. You can also find me on Instagram now. Finally, it's Dr. Skylar _ and on Facebook as well as Dr. Skylar Hamilton. I genuinely hope for all my fellow empaths out there, Soul Tribe members out there, legit, I get it. We're meant to heal the world. We're meant to do something on this planet. We're meant to raise a collective consciousness. I feel you. I got you. I'm out here doing the same thing. But guys, listen, if you don't do self-care, if you don't put up some boundaries, we're not going to be able to complete what we need to do. We're not going to be able to collectively raise the conscious level out there to kindness and love and automatic loving thoughts if we don't do self-care first. I implore you all to think, are you overexpending your bank account, emotionally depleting yourself for the sake of other people? And to take a moment and turn inward and to try to turn it into self-love. Abundant blessings, all you beautiful souls, and I'll see you all next time. Finally, it's here, available for pre-order of my book, Empower Your Child to Heal. 8 ways to help your child overcome anxiety, GI conditions, and autoimmune conditions. And it gets into everything in great detail that we've talked about in the podcast so far. What are your child's secondary gains? How is their attachment style impacting their health? And it goes into 10 things that your children wish that you knew about their anxiety or GI autoimmune conditions, and also gets into like what healing phases that they're in. So it really gets into all the things into great detail that we've talked about on the podcast, and it's available now on Amazon for pre-order. Thank you for your time. I feel so grateful you have listened to the end. When we begin to understand how our body manifests stress, trauma, depression, anxiety, and even unexpressed emotions, we then create a space and bandwidth in our minds to begin to heal our bodies. Healing is a decision, and I am grateful for yours. Abundant blessings, Dr. Skylar.
To learn more about the work Dr. Skylar is doing, please visit drskylar.net. That's drskyler.net. And remember to subscribe to this podcast wherever you like to listen.
Produced by Audavita Studios. Connect your voice to the world.